Hello, and thank you very much for coming along again this evening. This evening, in fact, we're going to be looking at a growing crisis, but not just in any one part of the world. In fact, it's around the world, all over the world. And it's happening at a pace that looks slow at the beginning, but it's gaining momentum, and it's a growth curve, so it's an exponential process that has to do, in effect, with climate change on a massive scale, the whole globe over, and the rise of sea levels. This is occurring much faster than any science model had predicted 5 years ago, but because of the melting of terrestrial ice from the glaciers and from the ice caps, there's been an addition to the volume of water in the oceans, and that means an increase in sea level rise, much more rapidly than we had thought. So rapidly that no nation state has really developed an adequate answer to it. And that's part of what we want to look at. In particular, we're going to be looking at this whole question of keeping in touch with it. So we're calling it Climate and Sea Level Update, because there have to be updates regularly from all different parts of the world. We're going to be looking for digital dispatches from a world on the edge of continents, and in a sense, on the edge of total environmental collapse. We're going to look in particular at the climate vulnerability in places like London, Venice, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Mumbai, Shanghai, Lagos, Boston, New York, Miami, etc. The coastal cities. It will have occurred to you, of course, that after Columbus discovered the New World, places like Lagos in Nigeria, Boston in North America, New York and Miami, all coastal creations after the discovery of 1492 of the New World, quote unquote, by Columbus. These areas are particularly vulnerable because they were set in place after Columbus created a link on a continuous basis between one part of the world and the other, based on a steady and predictable sea level. Now, places like London, Venice, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Mumbai, and Shanghai existed before the Columbian Revolution in international connectivity. But these later cities, Lagos, Boston, New York, and Miami, are all artifacts of the post-Columbian era. It's true that those cities are particularly vulnerable because they were created at sea level, but all of the cities along the coast, from London, which was created in Roman times, to all of the others, very prominent in the medieval period, are under stress. We began to see this because of the way coastal areas were devastated by extreme weather events like Hurricane Michael. Even the president took a tour of this circumstance and couldn't avoid being impressed by the devastation.
For nearly an hour, the president flew over a land-laid waste along the Florida Gulf Coast. Tiny Mexico Beach was left in ruins by winds blasting 155 miles an hour and a storm surge that towered 14 feet. Later, the president visited the town of Lynn Haven, marveling at what he had seen.
These massive trees are just ripped out of the earth. We've seen mostly water, and water can be very damaging and horrible and scary, you know, when you see water rising 14, 15 feet, but nobody's seen anything like this.
All of this as Hurricane Michael's explosive power has generated new alarm about climate change supercharging these storms. On 60 Minutes last night, the president said he no longer views climate change as a hoax, but he also expressed some ideas that are at odds with the facts.
I don't think it's a hoax. I think there's probably a difference, but I don't know that it's man-made. I think something's happening, something's changing, and it'll change back again.
Last November, the federal government's own climate report confirmed the consensus view that humans are driving the rise in global temperatures, saying, quote, "There's no convincing alternative explanation." The report also dismissed the idea of temperatures cooling again. Instead, it said they are only going up, including, quote, "more record-setting extremes."
You'd have to show me the scientists.
But last night, the president also said he thinks many scientists have a political agenda. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm William Brangham.
Right. He thinks that the scientists have a political agenda. It's worth seeing that in detail because it's an extraordinary assertion. Let's look at the interview from 60
We're not
Minutes.
denying climate change, but it could very well go back. You know, we're talking about over
that's
millions of
denying it.
years. They say that we had hurricanes that were far worse than what we just had with Michael.
Who says that? They say. I mean, the
People
people on
say
the phone?
people say that in the
Yeah, but what about the
nine-
scientists who say it's worse than ever?
You'd have to show me the scientists because they have a very big political agenda. I'm
So-
just telling you that you treated me much differently on the subject.
I disagree, but I don't want to have that fight with you.
Hey,
All
it's
right, we're
okay.
having another fight with you.
Leslie, it's okay. In the
Right.
meantime, I'm president and you're not.
Okay. In the meantime, I'm president and you're not. So he doesn't have to answer in reference to any kind of truth or even directly to our questions about what about the scientists. He's basically saying, since I'm president and make the laws of nature do not count anymore. Only my laws count. Right? I'm president and you're not. In the meantime, I'm president and you're not. Very, very troubling. His confusion and the power play to bludgeon the press is particularly problematic in the light of the latest scientific findings. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued its global warming of 1.5 degrees C, and perhaps the president should get out a little bit more and look a little bit at what's going on around the world. Perhaps he could go to dinner in Venice, for example.
Osservate l'altezza dell'acqua, dove arriva a quella ragazza in mezzo alla piazza.
It's pretty amazing. The Guardian carried this representation, in fact rebroadcast, of a YouTube video of what it's like eating pizza in Venice.
Osservate l'altezza dell'acqua, dove arriva a quella ragazza in mezzo alla piazza.
Okay, well, the Guardian is at least keeping up with these issues in England and keeping the rest of the English-speaking world in touch with them. But we ought to look at that global warming 1.5 degrees C report in detail because it's suggesting revolutionary change is
As
necessary.
we reported earlier, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a consortium of climate scientists, announced today that if the world community doesn't reduce carbon emissions drastically, millions of people across the planet will suffer dire consequences. But as William Brangham reports, heeding that warning now is a daunting challenge.
The UN's latest report, put together by over 90 authors and editors from over 40 countries, is probably the starkest, most dire warning yet about the severity of climate change and the cost of inaction. The report says that unless the world immediately begins reducing the burning of coal and oil and gas that drive up global temperatures, the world will suffer tremendous consequences. By as early as 2040, just 22 years from now, the UN says global food supplies will be threatened by increasing droughts and heat waves. Low-lying nations could be flooded by rising sea levels, potentially triggering huge flows of refugees. Fierce storms and wildfires will grow in intensity, costing billions in damages and lives lost. To keep even more drastic impacts at bay, the UN report urges the governments of the world to cut their carbon emissions enough to limit global warming to just 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's about 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels. But that would take a near revolutionary change in how the industrialized world creates electricity, grows food, and moves people and goods around. The UN acknowledges that, quote, there is no documented historic precedent for the changes needed to prevent even worse disasters from coming.
No documented historic precedent. Revolutionary change is needed. In fact, Jim Hansen has pointed out that because of the current trajectory, if it's continued, it's nowhere near what's needed. The Paris Climate Accord is not going to achieve what we had hoped it would.
In the Paris Climate Agreement, to try to keep global warming less than 2 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial conditions, that is not a safe target, in my opinion. In fact, it's a prescription for disaster. The last time the planet was 1 degree Celsius warmer was in the imminent period, the prior interglacial period, about 120,000 years ago. And sea level was 6 to 9 meters higher then. If we let that happen again, that means we lose all coastal cities. More than half of the large cities in the world are on coastlines. So we can't let that happen.
We can't let that happen because half of the world's cities, large cities, are on coastlines. And we're, in fact, soft-pedaling it. According to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the climate report understates the threat because people like Richard Alley have pointed out that they're using low estimates for sea level rise. He warns instead of a horrifying possibility of a 15 to 20 feet sea level rise within the next century. This is why in New York there's been a special series of programs put out now called Peril and Promise, the Challenge of Climate Change, looking at sinking cities around the world. They're calling it Sinking Cities, and the first broadcast came out this last Wednesday. You can see a replay of that this evening from 11 to 12 here in Boston, and it's replayed around the country now. Take a look.
Superstorm Sandy caught New York by surprise.
We were a city with absolutely zero coastal protection.
Can we defend one of the world's greatest cities from the next big storm and rising seas?
We get 6 feet of sea level rise.
It would be a catastrophic flood.
We know what the problem is. We now have to prevent the negative impact of climate change.
I don't think the answer is retreat from all of Lower Manhattan.
What if we just look at this a whole new way?
Yeah, what if we look at this a whole new way? Well, this is what they're going to try to do. In fact, tune it in tonight, 11 o'clock here in Boston. You can see what their proposal is for New York. It starts this week, and it's repeated usually on Sundays. So you can look at the first installment, which is New York City, but look at every other one coming on Wednesday nights, 10 o'clock Eastern Time, 9 o'clock Central, Peril and Promise. It's put out by WNET in New York, and it's really quite useful. Take a look. They're looking at 4 cities.
The world's great cities face threats they have never before encountered. New York, Tokyo, London, Miami. The threats come from the sea, from above, and from below. These are the problems and their solutions. For when the water comes.
For when the water comes. It's not a question if the water comes, it's when the water comes. They have one on Tokyo that's going to be forthcoming.
It's a city built for the future.
Tokyo is like the Rolls-Royce of city and engineering. It has most of the high-tech system that you can find in the world.
Ready for climate change?
Even though we've been trying our best, I don't think we can say that we're fully prepared for disasters.
If you start to have a major flood, we're all going to pay it.
Tokyo is defenseless against such rainfall.
Okay, that will be coming up on Wednesday. Try Miami. Even
Miami
more.
is considered the most at-risk city worldwide due to rising sea level and storm-related flooding.
We're going to get 2 feet of sea level rise by 2060. By 2100, we might get 6 feet of water. The water is coming.
Already see 20 days a year, the water is higher than the land.
Water is coming from the side, from below, from above. Miami, we've got to decide, how do we solve the issues of sea level rise?
Good luck. How do we solve the issues of sea level rise? Well, sinking cities in New York give a good example of how we didn't think about it.
If we understand how nature is trying to shape New York City, then maybe we can make New York City fit into the nature of the place, and in that way make it possible to live in the city into the next 400 years, and maybe the 400 years after that.
From the sky, it's clear that New York City was boldly built right to the water's edge. It's a coastal city surrounded by water on all sides. Just a century ago, there was more cargo tonnage and people passing through this port than all other major harbors in the country combined. With 578 miles of coastline, all that water is now New York's greatest threat.
The real challenge for us in the 21st century is we be as wise as we are smart. We're so smart about so many things. You know, we're so clever, and yet somehow when it actually comes to making the hard decisions, the wise decisions based on what we know, we have trouble doing that. I don't know how many more examples nature needs to give us to do the right thing.
How many more examples nature needs to give us before we do the right thing? Well, take a look at this extraordinary scene. This is Wall Street completely empty because of Hurricane Sandy and the evacuation demanded.
The mayor of the city of New York has ordered a mandatory evacuation. All residents are urged to comply with this evacuation request.
In 2012, Superstorm Sandy catches New York by surprise. The city is flooded with 1.6 billion gallons of water containing raw and partially treated sewage. The storm surge, measuring over 13 feet, engulfs New York with over 700,000 tons of debris. It is the worst natural disaster in the city's history. Trevor Holland is a resident and an attorney in a neighborhood called Two Bridges.
It's on the Lower East Side. It's called Two Bridges because our neighborhood is located between the two bridges, the Manhattan Bridge and the Brooklyn Bridge.
Right, and it's very close to sea level. One of the first to be inundated. And in fact, they're trying desperately now to monitor the waters around the city.
We've got a buoy offshore
Got a SON, an instrument that has many sensors on it, that's measuring pH, the oxygen, salinity of the water, temperature of the water, water elevation. And the instrument's all up and down the Hudson. It'll send the data to the internet, which we take into our database. We collect the data for the forecast model. Much like with the weather forecast, you can merge the best information you have to form the initial conditions in order to launch your next forecast.
These gauges help Orton understand which parts of the city are most at risk when the next big storm or hurricane hits. After Sandy, Orton's data was used in modeling to see what New York would look like with 6 feet of sea level rise by 2100.
So this is a satellite map showing New York City without any flooding. Shown here is Broad Channel, the Rockaways, Lower Manhattan, and over here is Staten Island. If you get 6 feet of sea level rise, the everyday average high tide is going to start flooding a lot of neighborhoods. It's high tide in 2100. This is now showing tidal flooding of places like South Street Seaport, Lower Manhattan, a lot of flooding around Jamaica Bay, also on Staten Island. Hundreds of thousands of people being flooded at that point. It's uninhabitable when you start getting flooded so many times per year. That's tidal flooding, but then there's also storm surges. We can also look at what 2100 would hold if we had a very severe storm like Hurricane Sandy, plus 6 feet of sea level rise. A much larger percentage of the coastal zone is flooded. The west side of Manhattan, the Tribeca district, Wall Street, Battery Park, Lower East Side.
Sandy flooded 51 square miles, 17% of the city. With 6 feet of sea rise, those numbers would be closer to 100 square miles, or about a third of the city underwater.
This kind of flooding would be catastrophic. There's massive infrastructural elements for a city of 8 million people that are in the flood zones. Transportation system, the tunnels, the subways, the electrical system, and of course a lot of these things were flooded just by Hurricane Sandy, so if you envision 6 feet of sea level rise, then a great deal more is at risk at that point. The whole city could be disabled in this kind of flood scenario.
The whole city can be disabled in what's coming. Boston has got an update. In fact, the mayor has given a new plan to the public, Resilient Boston Harbor, it's called. And in fact, you can get in touch with it through transition-studies.net. You hear his speech to the Chamber of Commerce. It has to do with trying to plan in a way that New York didn't ahead of Hurricane Sandy for a flood surge and absorb it. Not by building huge barricades, but by working very carefully and intelligently to absorb water as it comes in storm surges. This is happening around the world. Lagos coastal cities are threatened by forecast rise in sea level. The Hindustan Times carries articles like, beware, dangerously rising sea level could submerge Mumbai in 100 years. That's millions of people submerged. Beware. Right. Egypt's coastal cities affected by rising sea level. The whole Nile Delta. The reason why that's important is the Nile Delta provides a lot of the food supply for Cairo, which is upriver, not on the coast, but depends on the Nile Delta for food. Need from Miami to Shanghai, 3 degrees of warming will leave world cities below sea level. It's the program we did earlier on this topic. Are you ready? Climate ready, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, London, Hong Kong, Lagos, Cairo. We looked into it several years ago. But the problem is getting worse and worse. You can't comb over global warming. But the EPA has just taken its climate page down. It's kept the public ignorant by removing the information from the public. It's worse over at the Department of Interior. They're actually asking permission to destroy climate records. So it will be impossible to look at the past that the taxpayers paid to collect information about. This is really quite extraordinary. We are under an administration that thinks it can make new laws that overrule the laws of nature, and it can wipe out the public consciousness of what's already happening and happened in the past. Now, in the past, we've had courageous reporters like Edward R. Murrow. His on-the-spot reporting from London in a program called This is London gave us dispatches that convinced many Americans of the urgent need to join the struggle against Nazism in World War II. What we've got to do now is get digital dispatches. Now we can write them and send them around the world instantaneously. He only had 5 minutes a week, and he managed to pull a whole country into solidarity with the British to fight Nazism. But we need digital dispatches urgently at this point as updates from citizens in the world's climate-vulnerable cities. Sinking Cities is a new kind of letter from London. His sign-off and sign-on was, "This is London." Well, we're going to try to start doing this now. This is London, going underwater. Universities are trying to bridge the transitions, and in fact, we're going to be looking at climate and sea level updates, digital dispatches from a world on the edge. This is why a new kind of citizen science is emerging around the world.